So since I only have a few minutes and I want to leave time for discussion, I'll get right to the point. I'm going to boldly assert some things about the context-centered approach to psychology because I think they have a great deal of relevance for considering wellness. And with more time, I think I could demonstrate my points more fully and convincingly, but I'm going to do it briefly for the moment. There are things I can point you to read if you'd like more. So let me dive right in. Let's begin by defining contexts. Contexts are mental frameworks governed by presuppositions that set ground rules. And these ground rules establish psychological boundaries, not just for what you think and how you think, but for what you can think. And two common contexts that I want to focus on are mind and self. And these are psychological terms that are commonly used in everyday life, but here I want to define them in very specific ways. The mind as a context frames everything in terms of safety and winning. So it's everything that's defensive and self-protective about a person. In a nutshell, the mind is always looking out for number one. It cares nothing about happiness or satisfaction. Instead, it's focused exclusively on protection and survival. So the mind sees the world in terms of potential threat. It makes others wrong, it blames, it judges, and it operates entirely from a self-protective stance. So by contrast, when we operate from the context of self, we switch our focus from individual survival to connection and relationship. So the self understands that we're all in this together. It seeks human connectedness and interrelatedness. So the self is non-possessive, it's unselfish, it's open, it's generous, it's accepting, and it's loving. And so although we'd all prefer to operate entirely from the context of self, when we're under threat, we all have the capacity to shift into a mind-based kind of defensiveness. And that's just part of being human. So to operate effectively in times of real trouble, it helps to recognize and to acknowledge the mind's perspective rather than just try to deny it or to go around it. And only then can we fully add the input of the self. So while the mind is all about blame and avoidance, the self adds the essential elements of responsibility and community. So let's consider some examples of mind-self contrasts so that we can think about how they might relate to wellness. The first mind-self contrast I'd like to introduce is something called blame versus true responsibility. So when the mind sounds the alarm, it indulges in one of its classic maneuvers. It declares itself right and others wrong. And that's why it's no surprise that whenever we face a big challenge, whether it's a global challenge, something like the pandemic, or political divisiveness, or the threat of environmental catastrophe, or when we face a personal challenge, for example, conflict with your spouse, getting passed over for a promotion at work, or having a disagreement with your friends and family about politics, right? When we face these kinds of conflicts, we witness the mind doing a great deal of blaming. So, for example, at the start of the pandemic in the US, the president blamed all the governors of the states, and the governors in turn returned the favor. And of course, there's a reality basis for the mind's accusations, right? It's easier for the mind to argue from truths or partial truths than from outright fantasies. However, over the long haul, getting stuck in cycles of blame and recrimination doesn't do a lot to help us advance the cause. So when you make someone wrong, you just motivate them to make you wrong in return. Now, the alternative to the blame game is what context-centered therapists call true responsibility. It's the self-based acknowledgement of the core role that each of us plays in creating our experiential reality. And this isn't to be confused with times when people use the word responsibility as a synonym for blame, right? Such as when someone hurls an accusatory, "You're responsible for this," at us. No, true responsibility isn't about being right or wrong, and it can never be foisted on us from the outside. True responsibility is simply the acknowledgement that you are who you are, and you create your own unique experience of the universe. This form of responsibility is non-judgmental, right? It doesn't imply that you should change or that things should be different. Importantly, drawing attention to true responsibility isn't the same as saying that people are responsible for their circumstances, right? We are often at the mercy of events beyond our control. True responsibility, which is an aspect of the self, shouldn't be confused with blaming, an activity of the mind. So, for example, people of color in the United States who face dire socioeconomic circumstances aren't truly responsible for their plight. To suggest as much would be to unfairly engage in mind-based blaming. True responsibility instead refers to our responsibility for how we experience our circumstances, not to us being responsible for the circumstances themselves. So Black Americans who are racially profiled by police may be victimized by an oppressive state of affairs, but how they contextually make sense of themselves and their experience is something no set of circumstances can take from them. And distinguishing between blame and true responsibility really helps us harness the power of the self, and it helps us enhance wellness. For example, one 20-something who was sheltering in place at his mother's house at the beginning of the pandemic resented her criticisms of his messy room and erratic sleep patterns. And this produced a lot of emotionally exhausting family feuds. However, when he came to see that these were just self-perpetuating right-wrong battles, right, pitting his mind against his mom's, he was able to back off and take a different role. Recognizing how much his unanticipated return home had upset the family routine, he promised to be a better house guest. This lessened the tension enough for his mother to acknowledge that her son, who had previously lived on his own for several years, was now used to being treated as an independent adult rather than a child. Another mind-self contrast that can help us understand our responses to the pandemic and to wellness in general is that of being at effect versus being at cause. In the mind's quest to avoid blame, it often portrays itself as the victim of overpowering circumstances, right? What context-centered therapists call being at effect. Problems and mistakes are attributed to things like bad luck, the perniciousness of others, or events that are beyond our control. And of course, we all sometimes experience ourselves as being at effect in connection with factors we don't like and we didn't anticipate. For instance, like a snowstorm that leads to canceling a favorite outing, or the loss of a job because of corporate mismanagement. The coronavirus pandemic was a particularly powerful at-effect event, and just about everyone felt victimized by it in some way. The danger, of course, is that when we consistently view ourselves as victims, our sense of self is diminished, and our sense of well-being suffers. We wallow in self-pity and fault-finding rather than engaging in more creative problem-solving. And the self's alternative to being at effect is being at cause. So let me share a pretty personal example. My daughter Ari is an actress. That's her in the middle of that photo on my PowerPoint. When the coronavirus struck, she had just made her off-Broadway debut. But as a result of the pandemic, her show was closed. So would she deal with this situation by being at effect, cursing her miserable karma? Or could she shift to being at cause, actively taking care of herself and preparing for the next steps in her career? So like most of us, she did a bit of both. First she experienced a period of mourning for what had been lost, not just in terms of her own career, but in terms of the suffering of the other cast members, the producers, the stagehands, and so on. Then she shifted to a more active recovery mode, right? She stayed in touch with her friends and her cast members via the internet. She watched and rewatched some of her favorite theater performances, movies, and TV shows in particular. And oddly enough, she really got into watching old reruns of The Love Boat, an American show from the 1970s and 80s. She also created an online video with a friend that ranked the 50 best musicals that had won the Best Musical Tony. If you message me, I can send you the link. Right. So again, I'm not proposing that those first mind-dominated affect stages that people experience when they encounter trouble be skipped or overlooked. Why not take advantage of such a perfect opportunity to feel sorry for yourself? However, recognizing that self-pity is only a part of the story prepares you to adopt a broader perspective, especially one that includes finding opportunities to be of service to others. So, for example, a ballerina whose dance company had closed for the rest of the season at the beginning of the pandemic went back to her hometown, and after a few weeks of feeling lost, she found a way to keep in touch with the world of dance by providing online classes for the students at the ballet school where she herself had trained. Now, a third and final mind-self contrast that might prove beneficial in helping you think about wellness is what I call avoidance versus mastery. So it's useful to distinguish between problem-solving strategies that rely on avoidance, which is the mind's preference, and those that have mastery as the goal, which is the self's penchant. From the mind's point of view, why take unnecessary risks, right? Stay away from anything threatening, whether the threat's physical or psychological. Why ask for a favor and risk rejection, for example? So this strategy can prevail in the most trivial situations and in the most profound. So many years ago, a skilled tennis player gave up the sport entirely because he realized he might not be able to make it to the city finals, right? Why play if you might lose? There was a time in the history of medicine when research on syphilis was stymied because people were unwilling to utter the word or acknowledge the scope of the problem. The mind's impulse to avoid means minimizing, discounting, and distracting as much as possible. Now, consistent with the mind's suppressive tendencies, we are often encouraged to deny or skip past being upset by events. In this way of thinking, well-being is the absence of distress. However, denying our upset, ironically, only tends to make things worse, right? It's bad enough to feel upset. Feeling upset that one is upset adds insult to injury. Nonetheless, the avoidance strategy is a very powerful one. For example, during the worst days of the pandemic, media messages regularly encouraged people to take their minds off the situation, right? To be resilient, to be productive, to be creative. But from the context-centered perspective, this omits step one, a full recognition of the mind at work. And I encourage you to celebrate your minds as magnificent instruments of protection, always on the job and cleverly inventing vivid scenarios of doom and gloom. Here's the paradox. The more credit you give to your mind for its tireless vigilance, the more you let it be, the more space there is for the self to be heard. So don't put the cart before the horse. Allot time for self-indulgence and self-pity before moving on to wholesome projects, acts of good cheer, and celebrating your even-keeled wellness. This counterintuitive approach, noticing the mind before moving to the self, is ultimately the most efficient pathway. Further, while we're in the mind mode, strong feelings can be expressed, right? The full gamut from anger and shock to fear and sadness. To quote Dylan Thomas, somewhat out of context, do not go gentle into that good night. Anytime you're facing challenges in life, give your mind a chance to do its worst. So let me share another pandemic-related example. Unfortunately, the pandemic gave us lots of examples. When the pandemic began, a college professor found herself feeling a range of powerful emotions after her university moved classes online and sent all the faculty and students home for the rest of the semester. She was flooded with a mix of grief and rage, which she branded excessive and not normal. A colleague of mine reassured her that this indeed was normal and was not only to be expected, but applauded. All systems were a go. Everything was working just fine. My colleague encouraged her to spend a few hours without allowing any hopeful or optimistic thoughts to spoil her pity party. But the next time he spoke to her, a few days later, she laughed uncomfortably and admitted that she had had trouble keeping more positive thoughts from making an appearance. When you accept and attend to the mind leaves you alone a lot more. So the thing to remember is that all of us vacillate between the contexts of mind and self. Accepting the more unpleasant elements of this, namely the mind, is key to maintaining overall wellness. None of us are above the mind's occasionally getting the best of us. It happens, and we shouldn't expect otherwise or kick ourselves when it does. By encouraging people to appreciate the mind and be aware of how it works, we can help them strengthen the self and operate from it more readily. Even during distressing periods that feed the mind's worst impulses, it's helpful to remember that the mind's reactions are transient. They're forever changing. At the end of the darkly comic and touching movie Jojo Rabbit from a couple of years ago, which takes place in Nazi Germany, another challenging period in recent history, there's a quote from the poet Rainer Maria Rilke, and the quote goes, "Let everything happen to you, beauty and terror. Just keep going. No feeling is final." Perhaps this can serve as a mantra for all of us aiming to live lives of wellness. So thanks for listening to me today, and I look forward to the discussion period.
In the meanwhile, till the people maybe warm up, I do have a question, John, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
So you referred to context-centered therapy.
Yes.
Can you maybe a little bit extrapolate this idea to context-centered interventions more broadly? And what would be their kind of form, in your view, when applied outside psychotherapeutic setting, like organizations, work, and so on? I know that this is maybe not your narrow field of work, but maybe of interest more broadly for our audience also. Do you see some of the connections of your talk to the field of work, and specifically talking about interventions related to your story?
Yes. So context-centered therapy is mostly the work of Jay Efron, who's a constructivist psychologist and psychotherapist. And it operates from this idea that people sort of have certain ways of responding to the world. They're sort of systems that are structured in such a way that they respond typically in certain ways. And that's where a lot of the acceptance comes in here. In terms of thinking about context, it's the idea that if you shift contexts, you often shift people's reactions, right? You shift the way that they respond to events. This can apply in any situation. It applies in work situations all the time. So in addition, as you mentioned at the beginning, in addition to being a psychology professor and a psychotherapist, I'm chair of my department. And this requires attending to context all the time. And so in a workplace environment, one of the things, I guess this is true in a lot of environments, right? We tend to gravitate very easily towards the make wrong mind-based orientation. So we tend to criticize, point out when colleagues or coworkers are doing things incorrectly. And we're often surprised when what we get when we've made what we think is a very excellent point about the things they're doing poorly, we get them in turn making us wrong, saying, well, okay, but you're no good at this, and you made this happen, or they turn it back on us, because if you make people wrong, they will then quickly turn around and make you wrong in return. So the question is, in any context, including a work one, how do you engage people in such a way that you don't trigger this mind-based kind of responding? And a lot of times, the first thing I think that is very helpful is to just accept and embrace how they're feeling, what they're doing, because that sort of acceptance gives people degrees of freedom to shift. And so if somebody says, I'm furiously angry with what the boss has said, and I hate this job. And I think a lot of times what we do is we try to talk them down. No, it's okay. It's not that bad. Don't be so extreme, right? And what does that do? That makes, if somebody does that to me, I double down. I say, no, what are you talking about? It's even worse than I just said, right? I amplify it. But if somebody says, yeah, you're furious, you can't stand this place, now all of a sudden I can shift, because I haven't been made wrong. They're accepting me and my experience, and therefore I no longer feel as compelled to keep it up or reinforce the point. And so in a work context, paying attention to your coworkers and accepting them and their responses to things is often a contextual way of engaging that's different than what we often do.
Thank you very much. Brilliantly put. We have throughout the day had some sort of walkthrough from different angles and very multidisciplinary views, sometimes even remote throughout this day, which went to one single point, I think, and that is the importance of relationality and not seeing the phenomena of well-being as individual phenomena, but rather relational and so on. And then seeing your talk also as some sort of an extension of that. But another just observation from your talk, and maybe also commenting on some of the previous talks that we had today, and maybe even more broadly speaking, psychological thinking nowadays about well-being. We may think about well-being as some sort of continuum, where on one end we do have diagnoses like DSM and so on, your field of expertise, and on the other end we have some positive psychology labels like thriving, some sort of super positive psychological well-being and so on. What I've taken from your presentation is that we can also think about let's say, more positive ends of well-being, which are maybe not flourishing, not diagnosis, not languishing, but anything basically in between, without needing to address to super positive concept of positive psychology, like allowing, as you're saying, the mind first maybe to, like just chill out, if I can use some colloquial words there, and then let some space for self to join in and so on. That sounds really refreshing, because when we talk about positive well-being, we just tend to adopt positive psychology view, I think sometimes even uncritically. Can you comment on that a bit?
Yeah, I think we do that a lot. We have a tendency to have this notion that anytime you're feeling upset, there's something wrong with you. And a lot of times feeling upset, as I said in the talk, it means all systems are a go. Everything's working the way it should. Feeling upset is a part of being a person. And a lot of times I find with people that it's bad enough that they're upset, but then they're upset that they're upset. So somebody says, oh, I'm feeling sad because things aren't going well at work. What's wrong with me? Well, it's bad enough that you feel upset. So let yourself feel upset. Well, why are we adding this additional problem of there's something wrong with you that you feel that way? And I find that when people are able to accept being upset and not give themselves grief over it, that the upset is much less difficult to manage, and it ironically also tends to not last as long. And so if I wake up in the morning saying, I'm in a down mood today, but then I kick myself over it, I find the down mood lasts a lot longer than if I sort of just observe it and say, okay, that's where I'm at right now. It is what it is. And then often that will dissipate more readily. So that can be, I think sometimes we fall into a trap of being overly positive, that all negative feeling is pathology.
Thank you for bringing that kind of constructive psychology view on also positive aspects of well-being, like people who have normal functioning at work and so on. I guess it helps to maybe have some sort of a conceptual repertoire of addressing normal everyday functioning with all the stressors and everything, without jumping into positive psychology as the default option for understanding ourselves. We do have alternative views, and thank you for sharing that today with us.
Thank you.
Many thanks, Jonathan, and I hope we can continue the conversation also after the summit. We'll definitely make the videos available to all the registered participants, so I'm sure that your talk would be available for visibility also later on. So thank you very much, and let's continue the conversation on some other occasions also.